Hi students, welcome to Accelerate Tutoring, and in today's lesson we're going to be looking at heat treatment of ferrous metals. Now this topic is covered throughout the entire Year 11 and Year 12 syllabus, and it's very likely going to be tested in your Year 12 HSC papers or your Year 11 preliminary papers. So it's very important to know what all the heat treatment applications are applied to different ferrous metals. Now there are several different types of heat treatment processes. The very first one is called full annealing. Now what exactly is full annealing? So full annealing is where you heat the ferrous metal to austentize the material. And this is around 750 to 900 degrees Celsius. And the exact temperature is influenced by the percentage of carbon that the metal has. At this temperature of 750 degrees to 900 degrees, you want to soak the metal to homogenize it. What homogenizing means is that you want to create a uniform structure throughout the entire metal. The time that you soak it for depends on the size and shape of the metal itself that you're working with. After that, once the heating is done, you want to cool it very slowly in a furnace. The whole purpose of this is to relieve stress from cold working or from casting. So this process is done usually after the forming process itself. And after this process is done, what we end up with is a uniform grain structure with equiax grains. And the main mechanical properties of this is lower strength due to the equiax grains and the slow cooling, but we get a ductile and easily malleable material. So if we look at the microstructures before and after, here's the microstructure before. Over here, as you can see, we have long elongated perlite and ferrite grains. Here's our ferrite over here. So ferrite can be denoted by a grain with an alpha symbol inside, and then perlite is just the grain with lines going diagonally across. And here's our microstructure afterwards. As we see, we have equiax grains of perlite and ferrite. Obviously, this microstructure hasn't been completed, but this is roughly how it looks like. Now, the next heat treatment process is called process annealing. So we had full annealing before. Now we have process annealing. The biggest difference between these two is the percentage of carbon of the material itself. For full annealing, it's usually done for relatively medium to higher level or percentage of carbon in the iron itself. For process annealing, it's relatively low carbon steels, so less than 0.3%. So again, we heat it, but this time it's a lower temperature due to the lower carbon percentage, to around 550 to 650 degrees Celsius. Now, after this, we again soak it to allow recrystallization of the ferrite. And again, the time that we soak it for depends on the shape and size of the metal itself. Now, another difference between full annealing and process annealing is that in full annealing, we cool it very slowly in a furnace, whereas in process annealing, we air cool it. So we leave it out of the furnace, but again, let it slowly cool down, but in open air. Now, what happens is only the ferrite itself recrystallizes into equiax grains, while the perlite remains as elongated grains. Now, again, the main purpose of this is to relieve stress. So again, this would be done after forming processes such as casting or other metalwork processes to again relieve the stress. Now, a big benefit of this is that it's relatively cheaper as compared to full annealing, and it's more widely done in the real industry. So if we look at the microstructure of the material itself, as you can see before, again, similar to full annealing, we have elongated grains of perlite and ferrite, but afterwards, we still have the elongated grains of perlite, but this time we have equiax grains of ferrite across the microstructure. Now, the next heat treatment process is called normalizing. So what exactly is normalizing? So in normalizing, we create a homogeneous structure after casting, welding, or joining. So what we do is we heat to austentize the material. So again, 750 degrees to 900 degrees Celsius. And again, the time we soak it for is dependent on the size and the shape. And we soak to homogenize the material to get an equiax structure throughout the entire material. Now, the difference for normalizing is rather than cooling it in a furnace very slowly, we cool it in air very slowly. So it's very similar to process annealing, except the biggest difference is the temperature that we heat it at. So process annealing was 550 to 650 degrees. Normalizing, on the other hand, is to the austentized temperature, which is 750 degrees to 900 degrees Celsius. So it's a bit of a mix of both full annealing and process annealing. Now, again, the key benefits of this is to relieve stress. That's pretty much what all heat treatment processes do. They relieve stress after the forming process is done. And from this, what we get is a uniform grain structure. So before it's the same for full annealing and process annealing and normalizing. But afterwards, as you can see, we get an equiax structure of perlite and ferrite. Now, the next heat treatment process is called tempering. Now, this is done after the hardening process itself. So let's first go to the hardening process and then come back to tempering. So what exactly is hardening? Now, hardening is done for metal alloys that have a carbon percentage of above 0.4%. So what exactly is this? We heat it to austenize the material to around 750 to 900 degrees Celsius. We soak it at this temperature to, again, homogenize the material. All heat treatment processes are the exact same in terms of steps. You heat it to a certain temperature and then let it soak at that temperature to homogenize the material. Afterwards, we cool it very rapidly in water. And this process of cooling it very rapidly is called quenching. And when you quench a material, what do you form? You form martensite. So what martensite is an extremely hard microstructure, but the biggest flaw of this is that it's a very brittle material as well. So if you look at the microstructure, as you can see, it's a very, very high strength and hard material with excellent wear resistance, but it has a lot of brittleness as well. So hence, we go to tempering afterwards. So let's go back to tempering. So tempering is done after the hardening process itself. And this time you heat it to around 200 to 600 degrees Celsius. Again, the temperature range is dependent on the size and shape of the material. And the whole purpose is to maintain that hardness and the strength, but remove the brittleness. So if you see the microstructure before we have straight grains of martensite. Afterwards, the grains become a little bit more curled due to the decrease of brittleness. And we still maintain that high level of hardness and strength, but obviously it won't be as much as it was before. Now, the next two heat treatment processes are more unique. So we have case hardening / flame hardening or induction heating. All of these are relatively the exact same. The only difference is the methods you use to apply the heat to the metal itself. Now, it's used for steels with, again, above 0.4% carbon. So what do? We heat to austenize for a slow or low amount. And it's only the exterior of the metal. You do not soak in this heat treatment process. So unlike the other ones where we soaked it, the biggest difference was the entire material gets a uniform grain structure when heating is done. But in case hardening / flame hardening or induction heating, you do not soak the material at this temperature. You only do it for a short amount of time, depending on how much of the material itself you want the structure to be applied to. Now, after the heating is done, you want to cool it very rapidly. So again, this is called quenching. And what does this do? It forms martensite. Now, what the mechanical properties obtained from this is that you get a hard and wear-resistant material on the outside, but a high toughness and impact resistant in the core with an equiax grain structure. So if you look at the microstructure before, again, elongated grains of ferrite and pearlite. Afterwards, depending on how long you heat it for, you get a layer of martensite, and then the inner core is equiax grains of ferrite and pearlite. Now, finally, we have carburizing or nitriding. Now, these are very similar. Now, for this process, what do? It's used for ferrous metals with a percentage of carbon less than 0.4%. Now, we heat it below the critical temperature in a high carbon environment. So what this means is that you do not heat it to the austenitized temperature, which is between 750 to 900 degrees Celsius. It will usually be up until 600 degrees. Now, the heating environment that you do it in has to be high in carbon. So a lot of carbon has to be present in the environment. So what happens then is that the carbon itself dissolves into the exterior of the material. So what does this do? It creates a hard, wear-resistive surface, but a high toughness, impact-resistive core. So if you look at the microstructure before, again, elongated grains of ferrite and pearlite. Afterwards, we have a layer of graphite, which is the carbon diffused into the exterior of the material itself. But inside, we have equiax grains of ferrite and pearlite. Now, nitriding is very similar. The only difference is it's not a high carbon environment, it's a high nitrogen environment. And again, you'll have nitrogen dissolved on the exterior of the material itself. So that's all of the heat treatment processes that you will need to know for your HSC exams. So let's look at an example together. So this example is from 2019's HSC paper, question 24. So question 24 says, normalized high tensile steel has been chosen for the manufacture of the wing support beam of an aircraft. So this is a part of the question with an aircraft in part C. Part I says, draw and label the microstructure of a normalized high tensile steel and an annealed high tensile steel. So we've discussed both of these. Now, in an exam itself, when they talk about annealing and they don't specify if it's full or process annealing, often they are referring to full annealing. Very rarely will the question itself refer to process annealing. Process annealing is more related to the industry itself, but HSC examiners love to always ask you about full annealing instead. So in this case, in the question, we'll be looking at full annealing rather than normalized annealing. Because remember, the biggest difference between full annealing and process annealing is the temperature that you soak it at and the way you cool it. And if you remember the grain structure, if we go back, the biggest difference is that in full annealing, at the end, you get equiax grains of perlite and ferrite, but in process annealing, you only get equiax grains of ferrite. The perlite remains elongated, which is not what we want. So in this case, in this example, the question itself is referring to full annealing. So let's draw these microstructures. So again, we know that in normalizing, afterwards, we get very small, fine equiax grains of both ferrite and perrite. So the first step would be just to draw very small grains, like so. So the next step would be just to label the diagrams for sure. So here's some of our perlite. It's good to just spread it out all the way across the microstructure. And then put in our ferrite. Now all of the remaining white are our ferrite. So it's important to make sure that we label all of them with the alpha symbol. Now, some people like to leave it blank and label it. I personally like to put the alpha in just so you can distinctively tell what it is. And don't forget to label. So here's our ferrite. And here's our perlite. Now, again, this is equiax grains, but it's very small. Now, if we look at full annealing, we also have equiax grains, but it's relatively larger as compared to normalizing. So this time our grains would look something like so. And again, we have perlite, and we can put it in here as well. And the remainder is ferrite. So here's our ferrite. Here's our perlite. Now, the exact ratio does not matter as long as you show some ferrite and some perlite itself. Now, if you look at part 2, it says, explain how the microstructure produced by normalizing high tensile steel improves the steel's suitability for this application. And the first thing is, for all engineering studies HSC questions, it's never required to write full, thorough sentences like an English exam or science, like chemistry or physics exam. Engineering studies, you can leave your answers in dot points because markers itself aren't bothered to read full, thorough sentence structures. They would, as long as you can say the information correctly in dot points, that works. So in this case, in the question, it asks us how the microstructure produced by normalizing high tensile steel improves the steel suitability for this application. So for the manufacture of the wing support of the beam, the most important thing that you want is incredibly good strength. And that's exactly what it does. The fine and uniform grain structure produced by normalizing greatly improves the strength of the steel itself, which is exactly what we want. So let's write that down. Perfect. And that response itself would get you the perfect 2 out of 2 marks. So that's the end of this video about heat treatment processes used for ferrous metals. If you like this video, please make sure to subscribe to the channel. I'll be posting a lot more videos like this on both engineering studies and maths to help you ace your year 11 and year 12. Now, if you'd like to learn more about this topic or any other topics of your own choosing, be sure to contact us through our email or Instagram down in the description below, and we can get a free trial set up as soon as possible.